Choosing the perfect name for your show can be one of the trickiest parts of starting a podcast. There are so many podcasts out there already, and you really want to be finding one that hasn't been used before, that perfectly captures the essence of your podcast and also makes it very clear to any potential listeners what that podcast offers. To help you come up with a name for your podcast, I've created this video. We've sifted through hundreds and hundreds of podcast names and categorized names into 4 different types: the descriptive name, the clever name, the brand name, and the personal name. And in this video, I'm going to break down what these name types are so you can help choose the type that's right for you and help you narrow down that choice to finally name your podcast. Bear in mind that some of these types of names will blur between the 4 different categories, but it will give you a good idea of where to start. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to share with you 12 guidelines that you need to follow, whichever name you choose. Number 1, the descriptive name. So this podcast name is probably the most popular podcast name out there. It basically just describes exactly what's in the tin. So if you're making a podcast about cooking pizzas, for example, a descriptive name would be something like Pizza Cooking Masters or Learn to Cook Pizza. A descriptive name gives potential listeners a good idea of exactly what they're going to find in that podcast in around 2 to 6 words. They're not always easy to come up with though, especially if you're in quite a crowded niche like business, because a lot of these descriptive names have already been taken. You also still need to use descriptive words to help the podcast stand out and stick in their mind. And a couple of real life examples of popular podcasts that use a descriptive name would be the How To Podcast series or Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing. Advantages of a descriptive name is that they're easy to come up with. It makes it very clear to your audience or potential audience what's going to be in the podcast, and it can help get the podcast discovered in search. So SEO, search engine optimization. If you can name your podcast a very descriptive term that a lot of your audience will be searching for on Google, then it will help them find your podcast. But again, the disadvantages of a name like this is that a lot of them will already be taken, and they tend to be a little bit less memorable than some of the more clever names. So number 2, the clever name. It takes a little bit more work to come up with something unique, but it can be super memorable and it can work really well. So this is a name that incorporates the idea of your podcast into the name, but it's kind of put across as like a pun or a reference or some other creative element. So if we stick with the pizza example, rather than a really obvious descriptive name, a more clever title could be something like Toppings or Pizzazz. Just remember that new listeners will still need to get a good impression, a good understanding of what your show's about. Advantages of the clever name is that they are more memorable, they're more unique, so it's easier to find generally a unique one if you're going for something a bit more clever, like a pun. And they're often easier to find when you search by name. But the disadvantage is that they're potentially harder to find for those not searching by name, just searching for keywords. And if the name is too abstract, it could be difficult for the listener to understand what the podcast is about. One way around the searchability issue with names like this is using a subtitle. So for my podcast, Podcasting Amplified, I've added the subtitle, The Podcast for Podcasters. So if anybody's searching for a podcast for podcasters, they're more likely to find this. And we've also got 3 keywords in there: podcast, podcasters, and podcasting. Another one of my clients' podcasts is called The HIP, the Housing Industry Podcast. So the name of the podcast is The HIP. Obviously, that's not super searchable for somebody looking for a podcast within the housing industry, but then we've added that subtitle on the end. So it could be referred to as The HIP, but then when people are searching for a housing industry podcast, it's more likely to show up. Number 3 is the brand name. This one is simple, it's self-explanatory. You could simply use the name of your business as the podcast name. So some examples of this in action would be Inside Trader Joe's, Shopify Masters, or Slack Variety Pack. Now, to be fair, they do add some extra words to make it more interesting. It's not just named Slack or Trader Joe's, but it's basically leveraging the brand recognition you already have for your business to get people interested. For lesser known brands though, this might not be beneficial. Now, if your brand name almost by accident already works as a good podcast name, then that's great. But if it doesn't, if your business was called something like Thrive and it was a recruitment brand, then just calling your podcast Thrive or the Thrive podcast probably wouldn't help you to stand out or put across an understanding of what the podcast is about. And notice that those examples that I gave as well, Inside Trader Joe's and so on, None of them are just putting podcast or show on the end of them. They're making it a little bit more clever. And even if you do have a branded podcast, you don't have to use your brand name, obviously. This is just one of the types of names available. So for example, the company ZipRecruiter created a podcast called Rise and Grind. So it's kind of a clever pun on Rise and Shine. It's clear of what it's about sort of business, but it doesn't just use ZipRecruiter as the title, because that wouldn't be a great name. And often it can put people off if a podcast looks too corporate. So advantages of using the brand name is that it's easy to come up with and is likely to be available. Your brand advocates will know where to find you. So if you have a big following already, if your brand is already a popular brand, then that would help you. Whereas if your brand doesn't have a huge amount of equity yet, then it might harm the podcast's growth. And also you could end up putting people off that think the podcast is just an advert, basically, for your company, if you make it too branded. And then before we jump to those 12 guidelines, the final podcast name is kind of an offshoot of the brand name. It's the personal name. So for example, the Tim Ferriss Show, Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, the Joe Rogan Experience. So these are all leveraging the brand recognition that those names have. But even if you don't have any brand recognition yet, you could consider simply using your name as the title. I have seen this work for people. For example, the Graham Cochran Show. He helps people with online businesses grow, and I don't think he had much brand recognition just from the name alone within that niche before he started the podcast, but he's found great success. And if you do have an existing following, then that could help you. But at the same time, just from a name, it's not always clear what the show is about, so you'd need to do a lot of work on your personal brand to make that name work. And it's just really important to make sure that that name is unique and not in use. Like, there are so many podcasts that follow the same kind of formula, like Someone Talks. Often they use alliteration, so it'd be like Trish Talks, Tash Talks, Tim Talks, and there'll be like 12 different copies of each of these names. So make sure it is something unique, because it's going to be impossible for people to find you otherwise, even if you do have a strong following. So I hope this has helped give you an idea of what kind of podcast names you could be thinking of. I'm now going to give you the 12 guidelines that I recommend every single podcaster, if you're thinking about starting a podcast, if you're thinking about changing the name of your podcast, just make sure that your name has these 12 things. Number one, make it relevant to your show. So make sure that it's clear what your show is about, or it gives them a good idea before they click listen, or otherwise they might just scroll right past it. And this is why it's quite difficult to make those name branded podcasts work unless you've got a strong following and people know what you're about from your personal brand. Number two, the name shouldn't be too long or too short. So as I mentioned before, 2 to 6 words. One word can work if it's unique and memorable and it's clever, but those kinds of names are very hard to think of. If it's too long, it's going to be hard for your audience to remember. Adding on with such and such at the end is not normally needed, or the something podcast. The and the podcast isn't always needed either. You want it to be clear when they find your podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, this is what the name is, and that they don't have to sort of scroll along or wait for the app to scroll the name across to actually see what the full name is. Number 3, don't use any special characters like emojis or hashes or anything, because some platforms don't show them correctly and they just won't know exactly what the name is. It also just makes it harder to read. Like, I've seen podcast names with lots of ellipsis between each word, and it's just unnecessary. Number 4, avoid using swear words. Again, some podcast platforms aren't going to show these, or they're going to delist your podcast, and that's going to cause you all sorts of troubles. Number 5, the name should be easy to read. So again, this goes into that punctuation thing. Avoid unnecessary punctuation, and it should be sort of whatever language you're trying to reach. It should be easy for them to understand, correct grammar and stuff. You can use AI like ChatGPT to help you come up with different variations, and you can also ask it if it's easy to read for a speaker of whatever language that you're targeting. You can also put the name out there to your audience, like if you're on LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever, you can say, what do you think of these names or this name for a podcast? And do you find it easy to read, and so on? And your audience will quickly tell you if it's not. Number 6, the name should be easy to spell, because people are going to hopefully be searching for your podcast on Google, and you want them to remember how to spell it so that they can find it and share it with their friends. Number 7, avoid limiting yourself to particular schedules or formats within the title. So if you had a podcast called something like The Weekly Business Interview, something like that, your restricting yourself to a weekly podcast and to an interview format. And these things can change. These things should change based on the needs of your audience. So I would avoid doing that, because it just means that it's not going to be relevant in the future, and you're going to have to go through potential rebrands of your podcast, which is not ideal if you can avoid it. Number 8, avoid using the term podcast or show in your podcast name. It's unnecessary padding, and it doesn't help with search. It doesn't help with readability or anything. If you have to use something to differentiate yourself, then you can at least try and think of something a little bit more clever or outside the box, like the Gary V audio experience, for example, rather than simply the Gary V podcast. Number 9 is check the name is available. And this is definitely one of the most important parts of picking a podcast name. There are so many podcasts out there now. You want it to be easy to search for, and you don't want any trouble with people, sending you trademark disputes or anything like that. So just have a look on Podchaser, Spotify, iTunes, trademark listings. I can't offer any legal advice, but if you want to go down that route, you can speak to a legal advisor and make sure that name is available and not in use. And number 10, keep your ideal listener in mind. Now, keeping your ideal listener in mind is something that you should be doing regardless of what choice you're making with your podcast. It's the most important thing, really, because without an audience, you don't really have much of a podcast. It doesn't have to be a big audience, even if you only got 2 people listening. What do those 2 people really love? What do they want to hear? What would entice them? What kind of other podcasts do they listen to that maybe you could get some inspiration from the name of those podcasts? Number 11, do you like it? Now, this is probably slightly less important than the other ones, because at the end of the day, you're creating this content for your audience, but you're going to be reading it, writing it, saying it a lot. So it is still important that you like this name, or you're just going to build resentment as you record more and more episodes. Number 12 is aim for clear and clever. And I've split this into 4 different categories of title types. But if you can make it clear and clever and unique, it's kind of the gold standard. I know that's difficult these days with millions of podcasts out there, but that is what you're aiming for. And those are the 12 guidelines and the 4 podcast name types. Let me know in the comments below if you do choose one of these and end up naming your podcast. You can drop a link to it in the comments, or just let me know what you're thinking. Which of these types are your favorite, and which of these guidelines does your podcast name maybe not follow that you're maybe rethinking? It'd be great to know if this has helped you out. And for more podcast tips, guides and tutorials, hit that subscribe button. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.